So today I'm doing a review of this Octopus Homage watch. It was sent to me by the brand to review off of AliExpress, so keep that in mind. I don't have to send it back and I am able to keep the watch, but they don't have any insight into what I say in the review, and they don't have to review the footage beforehand. So let's jump into it. So we have a diameter of about 36 millimeters, lug to lug of 42.9, height of 11.1, with the Cyclops we're looking closer to 12, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some of the general specifications for this watch, we're gonna have the PT 5000 movement beating away in here, which is one of those just classic Chinese-made ETA 2824 clones. It does have a 28.8 thousand beat rate. You have that nice 8 beats per second sweep to the seconds hand, which is always, I think, good relatively, especially at this price point. We do have a screw down crown with 100 meters of stated water resistance. This does state it uses sapphire crystal, which is done in a boxed kind of variation. It doesn't state whether or not the Cyclops is sapphire, but let's just assume it is. And it does say that it does use AR coating. We have BGW9 for all the hands and the indices, which is lovely to see. I'm glad they went for that over C3. And really, last but not least, this retails directly on AliExpress for $232, give or take. Or if you want to upgrade to the quote-unquote upgrade to the Sellita SW200 movement, you can do that for $345. So an extra about 110 bucks. Starting off with the dial of this watch, and really, taking it away, it is a Rolex style dial. It's nothing we haven't seen before. We have stick markers or rectangular markers for every index, 12 double index at 12, and then the classic baton style handset. It is very clean, very classic. I do think they got the proportions pretty much correct here. And there really isn't much to focus on other than the fact that they have done a good lumen fill. The markers do have a good amount of shine to them. They aren't the largest, and you don't see a lot of the metal outside of the actual applied lume, but the same is pretty much true for the Rolex, so I can't complain too much. Moving the hands out of the way for a second, of course this watch does feature a Cyclops. Of course you were doing a magnification of the date. If you look a little bit under it, of course you can see it is a relatively smaller date. I think I would have preferred it without the Cyclops. I'm not a big fan of the Cyclops anyway, and it's just kind of like an extra detail I don't think needs to be there. I do believe you could probably try to burn that Cyclops off. You've seen it done in YouTube videos before, so maybe you can try that yourself. That aside, very clean dial. This is what they consider a black lacquer. To be fair, I would call it probably a little bit more of a black subtle sunburst. It's hard to see, but at certain angles that sunburst pattern could come out. I can kind of see the lighter blackish, brownish, copperish tone coming out here in that little bow tie effect. I do like it because even though it is a sunburst-y style dial, it does lean very dark in its saturation. The sunburst is not something you see very often, and realistically you only see it in very harsh light or very direct sunlight. And pretty much any other time of day, it's basically just monotone in color. It's deep in its color, and I think it looks good. They did do a decent amount of text on the dial here. They have Octopus Kraken, which is the name of this sub-brand of watch. I think Octopus is a little bit of a weird name to have for the brand itself, but that aside, we have automatic water resistance and 100 meters there at the very bottom. I don't think they really put anything frivolous on the dial. I think they could have maybe taken away, automatic down here, or they could have not had Kraken, or whatnot. To be fair, not an overboard of text by any means, and it just is what it is. I do think it's printed fairly well, at least from wrist view, and I do like that they went with this pure white tone that matches the pure white of the seconds track along the outboard. Taking a look in natural light, we can see those more subtler grayish brownish tones come out of that sunburst dial. Thankfully, even in direct sunlight, you can get some very deep, dark black inky tones to still come out. So it is one of those weird dials that feels somewhat lacquered, feels somewhat sunburst, but realistically, it does look good in direct sunlight. The bezel still has some pop to it, which is surprising. The finishing looks great. And realistically, it's not bringing to light any issues in the finishing or in the looks of the watch. Moving into the shade, we're getting none of those more sunbursty tones now. It is a completely pure black dial. The bezel's shining a lot more. The tiny pieces of the markers are shining a little bit more, and it is just a nice soft metallic feel to the watch. There's a little bit of a glow coming from the bracelet, from the bezel, from the case, and it does just look great in kind of shaded, more subtle light. So taking a look at macro, and you'll have to forgive me because something in combination with the weird finishing techniques of this dial and my temporary studio setup wasn't letting the video really come through properly, so you'll have to deal with these photos. The finishing is done pretty well. There isn't a lot of egregious marks or terrible QC'd things. You can see the handset looks pretty nice and glows in a pretty decent shine, I would say. is bifaceted. You have this beautiful light play that happens. The lumen fill is done pretty well, and it isn't splotchy or ugly really in any way. And it just looked nice from first impression. When you look a little bit closer, we can see some issues. Like here on the edge of the minute's hand, we can see there's a couple of scratches and marks done to it. Realistically, just depending on the angle, these can go away, but undoubtedly you'll see it here and there. Have I ever noticed it from wrist view? No, but again, it is there, and it is possible for it to, be on yours if you order one. For example, right here, I just moved the watch slightly and now the mark has disappeared. So it's not perfect. There are other QC issues, like here at the 6 o'clock marker, there's almost like a dent in the marker itself. There's some slight little hairline scratches, some fuzziness around some of the markers themselves, but it's pretty decent overall. You can see like these markers over here pretty much look perfect. There isn't that much really wrong with the dial, and to be fair, they aren't large metal indices anyway, so there's not a lot of space to have issues happen. Overall, I do love the fact that you get this deep inky blackness to the dial itself. It has a beautiful contrast for the markers, or beautiful contrast for the printing that's on the dial. It does, I think, just look pretty premium. The fact that you get this beautiful subtle reflections that go onto the almost like mirror-like surface from light, or from like the sun, or some kind of light source, bring some more life to the dial. Sometimes you can get lucky and get these browner tones to come out, but most of the time you're just getting a nice glassy look to it. Goes from the deep black to the glassy to the markers themselves popping and going either black or going more electric in a sense. But what's nice is when you get off angles or at certain angles, you can see these more charcoal tones that come out of the dial, and it is nice. It adds another depth and layer to the dial that wouldn't otherwise be there, and I think the watch is better for it. It looks interesting, and I appreciate the fact that it has this depth to it. So moving on to the case of this watch, I think it is pretty classic. Of course, we have a more mid-century Rolex style case here with the relatively thinner case, the thinner lugs, the more rounded, softer oyster case style along the edges. What I do really like about this specifically is we have this engine turned bezel style, and one, that's not something that modern Rolex does, but two, they're bringing back this vintage styling in a much more modern package. If you're going for any of those true 70s, 80s, maybe they made it into the 90s, I don't quite remember, but more vintage styled Rolexes, it's gonna feel a little bit more flimsy. The bracelet's not gonna be solid like this bracelet is. The movement's gonna be a little bit more fragile. The watch probably won't be, honestly, even as water resistant as this watch is. There's concessions you're giving. One, it's gonna be a lot more expensive. Two, it's gonna be more fragile. Three, it's not gonna feel as well built as this watch. So there's definitely pros to getting something like this. It's just whether or not you can get over the fact that the name says Octopus, and two, wearing a Homage watch. But digressing, we have beautiful circular brushing along the lugs here, done in a pretty fine grain. It doesn't look cheap. It doesn't look badly done by any means. On the side of the case, fully high polish. You can see we do have a high polish to that bezel as well. It's hard to kind of capture on camera, but the bezel has a shape where it's slightly thinner towards the very bottom and bows out a little bit more towards the edge of the crystal, more of like a conical, very gently conical shape to it. Of course, on the very top of the bezel itself, we have this more brushed, ribbed pattern with every 5-minute mark being this more defined, polished square section, and then the double square at 12. It almost gives the feel of being a rotatable bezel, but it is not at all. The crown here is relatively small. To be fair, it's pretty easy to grip and it has good knurling on it, so I'm not gonna complain too much. It's also not a manual wind watch, so you don't have to interact with the crown overly often. The winding of it, a little gritty, not the best feeling, but that's true of most manual wind movements, especially sub $1,000. Once we put the crown out to the first position, actually I believe I'm at 11 p.m., so let's actually just set the time first. When you actually flip over the date, it's a really defined click. You can hear it, you can feel it mechanically. It's a very sturdy overall operation in that part of the movement. Same goes as you're setting the time. The hands feel nice, the hands feel fluid. When you go and actually set the date itself, it's a pretty defined action. You can feel the gear kind of push and turn over as it's about to change. I really have no complaint for the movement feel overall. Same goes as well for the difference in crown positions. The date position, the time setting position, and the zero position all feel distinctly different from each other and have very definitive clicks for each. And that's not something you get with most watches, to be honest. It has a really nice crown feel there. Screwing down is not the best feeling. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't catch perfectly and it doesn't want to screw in all the way, or at least it just doesn't feel like it wants to screw in super easily. That being said, once you get it in, it feels tight. It feels, safe in a sense. You can probably take this in the water and be fine. When we look at the bracelet here, fully vertical brushing on the top of the links, no englage on the side or anything like that. We have full high polish on the sides. We do have screw links for the bracelet as well, which is nice to see. The polish on the sides continues into the clasp side, the other end of the clasp side. The clasp itself is a nice classic fold over clamshell deployant clasp. Very nice kind of snick and snack, very good feel to it. It is just a relatively well-built clasp, to be quite honest. You even have a articulating clamshell end right there, which is something you don't even see in most watches. I mean, even some Tudors don't have this, which is awesome. So really good clasp system there. The only thing I don't love is you do have the same kind of easy link extension you have with most modern Rolexes, but it's not on the fly adjustment. You do have to like switch in between the small little positions. You have 1, 2, and 3. So it doesn't leave a lot in terms of micro adjustment, and at least for me, this little easy link extension is too much of an extension. If it gets too hot, my wrist is like swelled up. So it's kind of, your mileage may vary. It might be a better system for you. I don't think my wrist size changes overly when it gets hot, so maybe I'm not the intended audience. Looking at the case back, boring, just brushed, a little bit of polish on the edge, kind of classic Rolex coin edge case back there. Looks like it's pretty much straight from the factory. They have little tape on each side of the lugs that they're putting on the watch bracelet, which is nice to see though. They're trying to make a quality product and not ruin the watch before it gets to you. Overall, a really nice case. I love that there's curvature here to the lugs themselves, very thin mid case overall, and you can just kind of imagine this leads to a nice wearing case. You have some of the height hidden here in the case back in traditional oyster style, some of the height hidden in the crystal, but the kind of flat-ended bezel is not really helping in that department. But when you look dead on, you really don't notice it, and the watch isn't even thick enough to where that thicker bezel construction feels out of place. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing my Laurier Neptune here, which is about 38.5 millimeters. So there we have it on my 6.5 inch wrist. I think it looks fantastic. I don't know if it's exactly the same specifications with a normal 36 millimeter OP style case or Datejust style case, but it feels very similar. It has a very similar footprint. It's similarly comfortable. And it is just, I mean, they're working off a perfect case template in a sense, and this one does it justice. It doesn't redo any weird proportions that try to change it up or have restrictions because the movement's not thin enough or anything like that. This does wear supremely well on the wrist, comfortably low to the wrist. The bracelet is very well built and sturdy. The case feels rock solid. The light play you get from the indices, from the bezel, the kind of pure white tones you get from the lume. Everything is well done here. The only thing I don't personally aesthetically like is the Cyclops, but again, you can maybe try to do some at-home things to get rid of that. It's kind of more down the barrel. You can see it conforms pretty much perfectly to the wrist. There isn't daylight shining through. Even if I try to make it shine through, it can't that well. Again, you're never really wearing your wrist like this, flexing your arm all the way down in a weird position. If you have it at a more like normal resting position, it wears pretty close, pretty comfortably. There isn't any crazy sharp edges. Even the edge of the case here, where it could be the sharpest from machining, isn't really even that bad. It's not that sharp. It's not that, oh my god, if I push this really hard into my finger, I might puncture myself kind of thing. So I would say it's machined well because of that, or at least it's finished well after it's machined. I like that they didn't make the buckle too thick. It doesn't really like rise up off the wrist too much in a sense. They could have, I think, probably included maybe some glide lock system, and that would have been nice, but I'm fairly happy with it the way it is. One thing to note that this bracelet does really well is the underside of this clasp is, I can't even think of the term right now, but it's rounded here on the very edges. So it gives this super smooth, silky feel as you're putting the watch on and off. It is awesome to feel. That's exactly how Rolex does it in all their clasps, and that was what makes it feel so premium and almost makes the metal feel soft, which is a weird way to say it, but it is buttery feel on the wrist. The only thing that can be a little bit harsh is if you put this flip lock clasp a little bit too far back, this will fall a little bit below the bracelet, and this edge is probably the sharpest part of the bracelet. So when you're sliding this on and off, this could honestly cut you a little bit. This can scratch you and scrape you a little bit. So maybe don't put that all the way back and you'll just be fine. Because of the silky feel of this clasp here, and the case back has that same nice feel to it, this is a super comfortable watch on and off the wrist, and honestly feels premium as you put it on, which is pretty crazy. All right, so as a preface, I've owned, sized, and changed straps on literally hundreds of watches. This is the hardest bracelet I've ever come across in taking off the end links. The end links have such a tight tolerance, and the spring bar is so lodged in there, I cannot get this bracelet off. Do I just have a simple Bergeon spring bar tool? Yes. Would this be easier with something like spring bar pliers? Probably. But the fact that I've never had to use spring bar pliers, and if you're buying this watch off of AliExpress, you're probably like me, and you don't want to spend money on spring bar pliers. This is super tough to get off. It's so intensely on there that when I try to open up one side, it feels like it comes out of the hole, and I try to open up the other side, and it really just doesn't move at all. Like the other side is moving, and then as soon as I try to like keep going back and forth, it just falls back into its normal hole and like basically hides away. Like it's literally impossible for me to get this bracelet off. Long story short, I'm not going to be trying this on any other straps because I can't put it on straps. As a general rule of thumb, oyster cases don't look amazing on leather straps, but this more pre-ceramic kind of vintage style Submariner oyster case, I don't know why I said Submariner, but oyster case typically does look decent on straps and can look decent on straps. So you could play around with straps if you have a spring bar tool or spring bar pliers more correctly. As a note, I would say to Octopus, please put drilled lug holes. If that's a possibility, if that's something the brand can do, if that's something that doesn't increase the cost too much or increase the intensity of the making of this case, please put drilled lug holes. One, because all the watches that are, based off of this watch and in that vintage style will have that feature. But more importantly, it's so hard to get the bracelet off. It's so hard to get into those spring bars that if you had drilled lug holes, I wouldn't be having this issue. So I've been defeated. Maybe you won't be. But yeah, just had to share that. I've been trying to get this off for like 15 minutes. It's not going anywhere. So best of luck. So taking a look at the Lume here, and honestly, it is pretty well done overall. You can see there's a decent amount of application on the indices. The hands are a slight bit lighter and a slight bit smaller than the indices themselves. I do wish they bulked up the hands to at least have the same amount of like Lume surface as the markers do. It just would feel a little bit more cohesive. But other than that, it looks good, it shines decently well. It's actually shining so bright and reflecting off the parts of the watch where it almost looks like there's Lume pips on the outside, and that's just crystal distortion. There are no Lume pips at all. So it glows well, it's very legible. It won't last forever, but it's a very good application of BGW9. Re-illuming and comparing to a new Timex Snoopy I have. Look, a little Snoopy on top of his doghouse. I have a new watch, one mainly because the Lume on this one's a little bit newer. It has a better battery in it, or newer battery, but also this leans more true blue. So even though BGW9 has a blue leaning Lume signature, you can tell by comparison to this almost true blue Indiglow, this is basically green. Now, again, it's not truly green. It is a green BGW9 leaning kind of blue-green. Anyway, digressing. Pretty decent Lume on the Octopus here. Not badly done at all, and really not much I can complain about. And then just for a quick comparison, just to have all three kind of in the same frame. Old Snoopy, which pretty much the Lume signature matches the BGW9 glow. a kind of greenish leaning blue. New Snoopy, which is more of a true blue. So all three together, you can kind of see the range of color. So pros and cons of this watch here, and I think one of the biggest pros for it is just that it is a genuinely beautiful case they did. Of course, it is not their own case, it's not something they created out of thin air, but they executed very well with what they did. It's finished very well, it's constructed nicely, there aren't any really harsh edges to the case itself. The bezel is executed beautifully and has a nice luster to it, especially at the price point. I'm surprised this can be machined to this level. And again, the fit and finish is great. The feel of the clasp, the underside, the silkiness of it, it is like surprisingly a nice watch to take on and off. It feels premium in that sense, which is something I can't say for a lot of watches. Now moving on, I think another big pro is that we just do have good dial quality here. The indices, I think, pop off the watch pretty nicely. The lumen fill is done well. It's done to a good standard. It is nice and pure white and really pops off the dial itself. The printing is done well. The depth of the color to the dial is done well. The fact they've somehow mingled a lacquered / sunbursty type finish to the watch looks great on the watch. So there's not much bad I can say about it, but you know, there definitely are cons. And last but not least, I think the watch is great value. We're talking about $230 give or take, and there's not even a lot of automatics for that price anymore. To be fair, on AliExpress there are, but for the build quality, for the finish, for the aesthetic, for the way it fits on wrist, this is great. It's something that I wouldn't mind paying this price at all. I think you are absolutely getting what you pay for, if not more so. It definitely really competes with watches from, like, let's say micro brands that range between $700 to $1,000 pretty easily, and it does feel better than even a lot of watches above the $1,000 price point in terms of some of the fit and finish, in terms of the wearability, in terms of how nice it feels on wrist, and the kind of proportions they went with. Now moving on to cons, and what I really don't like about the watch is the handset. Now this isn't necessarily the brand's fault because they are copying a design of Rolex and they pretty much do the exact same thing, but that doesn't mean you can't improve and you can't iterate even if it's copying something. The handset here I think is a little bit small, or at the very least it is more metal than it is Lume infill, and it feels at odds with the actual dial design. The markers on the dial by comparison are very thin metal and a lot of Lume, whereas the hands are the opposite of being a lot of metal and a little bit of Lume. And I think when they're just lined up, it looks odd. At the end of the day, if they make the hands a little bit more equivalent to the indexes themselves, or the indices rather, I think it just look a lot better. Another big con for me, I don't like the Cyclops. I don't like it when Rolex does it. I don't like it when any brand does it. I don't think it really adds much to the aesthetic and looks just weird in my opinion. Sure, the data is much more readable. Sure, the Cyclops is done well here to where it actually magnifies it very cleanly and very clearly. And if you like the Cyclops, maybe you'll like this watch. But I don't like it there. I don't think it, again, I just don't think it aesthetically looks nice. And last but not least, and this is like, it is a con, but it isn't. Again, this was so hard to take off the bracelet, I physically could not. The end links either have too tight of a tolerance or they're just machined in an interesting way. I do think drilled lug holes would benefit this watch greatly. I don't think the average watch person will be able to take this watch off a bracelet, which at the very least, the bracelet is really well built. So to be fair, most people probably won't, but if you want to mix it up with straps, with NATOs, whatever you want to put on the watch, it's very difficult to do. So I think drilled lug holes would aid that completely. I think it would look aesthetically nice. And give it just a little bit more of a vintage feel, which this watch is already going for with the aesthetic and especially with that bezel. So final thoughts, I think this is a fantastic piece. I was pleasantly surprised by it. I've ordered, a couple times these kind of OP Datejust knockoff type situation watches, and to me they don't really usually hit the nail on the head. The proportions are a little bit wrong, the case is too bulbous, the finishing's not quite there, the case is too thick. There's all these little things that make it feel, at least to me, not as good as it could be, and more just stealing an aesthetic rather than making a good watch. This, by comparison, is a good watch. Just on paper, by the way it feels, the way it looks, the way it functions, it is well built. So it just comes down to the fact of whether or not you can get over the aesthetic. Here as well, if you can get over the name of the watch. To be fair, I don't focus on it too much. Thankfully, your eye is really drawn to more of the elements of the watch rather than the text on the watch itself. But kind of digressing, this is a great watch. If you want a, in a sense, tester for what maybe a Datejust type watch would feel like, this is a great alternative because the proportions are pretty spot on. If you want something that's just a nice little travel watch that looks aesthetically nice, this is great too. If you honestly just want a modern version of a vintage watch, which would be much more fragile, this is an awesome option because one, it's going to be much cheaper than that vintage watch, but two, much more well built. Again, this is a bezel design that Rolex doesn't do anymore. I doubt they're going to bring it back, and I like the way it looks. It's different. It doesn't really look like every other watch out there, which is nice. So I really enjoy this piece. I think a great option would be offer a no date variant, which I would have preferred much more. To be fair, from what I hear from most brands, date variants tend to sell better anyway, so I don't think it would make sense for them to introduce that version. But at least for aesthetics, I would like it. But I think if you're interested in this piece, undoubtedly go for it. It is worth the money wholeheartedly, and was really a very pleasant surprise to me. But anyway, that's all for me. Thank you as always for watching the video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I'm more than happy to answer them. And yeah, I'll see you in another one.